The night was colder than most in the little frontier town of Dry Creek. A cruel wind swept dust and grit down the narrow, lantern-lit street, rattling the loose shutters of saloons and stores long since closed for the evening. But while the town slept, a darker gathering stirred at the edge of the settlement. In the worn-down livestock barn that had been converted into an auction house. This wasn't the kind of auction where cattle or horses changed hands. No, tonight's business was far more sinister. Men with money jingling in their pockets and whiskey on their breath crowded the benches, waiting for what they called fresh stock. There was a restlessness in the air, a hungry excitement, that had little to do with ranching or trade. At the center of it all stood the auctioneer, a slick man named Jed Crowley. His voice was as greasy as his hair, and his reputation for cruelty reached far beyond Dry Creek. Crowley thrived on human misery. He knew that broken souls could be sold just as easily as any animal. Tonight, he promised something rare, something that would stir the crowd into a frenzy. When the side door creaked open, the chatter fell to a hush. A young, trembling woman stepped inside, her face pale, her body weak. She clutched a bundle in her arms, a bundle wrapped in a blood-stained cloth. Gasps rose from the crowd. It wasn't a horse, it wasn't a servant, and it wasn't even a woman for labor. It was worse. It was a newborn child. The baby was barely hours old, her skin still fragile and red, her tiny cries weak and pitiful. The mother's legs shook, under her own weight, but she obeyed the shove of Crowley's men, staggering forward as he barked out his announcement. "Gentlemen," he drawled, stretching the word like honey masking poison. "A rare offering tonight. A child, born just this morning. The mother's got no use for her, and the law don't care none. So why let her rot when she can be useful?" A ripple of laughter and disbelief passed through the room. Some men leaned forward, eyes narrowing with curiosity. Others scoffed, muttering about the absurdity of paying for a wailing scrap of flesh, but Crowley was a salesman, and he knew how to stir greed. "Think of it," he said, striding across the platform. "Raise her as you see fit. Mold her into what you want. Or if the child don't last, well, at least you'll have had your fun bidding." His words dripped with mockery, each syllable slicing at what little dignity remained in the room. The mother sobbed, clutching her baby tighter, but her arms were pried away by Crowley's men. They laid the infant on a rough wooden crate beneath, the harsh glow of the lanterns. The crowd leaned in, eyes glittering, some with amusement, others with calculation. Bidding began at $1. At first, no one spoke. The silence was broken by a drunkard's laugh and a lazy offer of $2, which brought another man to shout $5. Before long, the barn filled with shouts, coins clinking, and boots stamping against the floor. They weren't bidding because they wanted her. They were bidding because cruelty was a game, and tonight the game was alive and crying before them. The child squirmed weakly on the crate, her cries drowned by the rising din. To most in that room, she was nothing more than a curiosity, a pitiful gamble worth the price of a bottle of whiskey. But beyond the circle of jeers and laughter, in the shadows near the back wall, a tall figure stood silent. A man with a broad hat pulled low, his coat dusted with the road and eyes sharp as flint. He said nothing, his jaw set, his arms folded. Unlike the others, he didn't laugh. He didn't shout. He just watched, and as the bidding grew louder, as the child's weak cries echoed against the wooden beams, that silent man's hand shifted ever so slightly toward the inside pocket of his coat, where a thick leather wallet waited. The crowd didn't know it yet. The auctioneer didn't sense it. But tonight's game was about to change forever. The bidding climbed, though not with any real seriousness. One man slapped his knee and shouted $10 just to hear the room roar with laughter. Another claimed 15, staggering half-drunk before collapsing back into his seat. To them, this wasn't trade. It was sport. and the newborn child was the cruel prize. Jed Crowley thrived in this chaos. His eyes darted across the crowd like a buzzard circling over carrion. "That's more like it, gentlemen," he bellowed, slamming his hand against the podium. $15! Who's got 20? Come now, where's your nerve?" The mother, her body trembling and her eyes wet with tears, reached out as if she could somehow snatch her baby back. But Crowley's men forced her aside, their laughter sharp and cutting. The infant's cries weakened with every passing second, yet no one cared. No one, it seemed, except the man standing at the back of the barn. Samuel Blake, a rancher known to most in Dry Creek, though few claimed to know him well. He owned more land than nearly anyone in the territory, acres that stretched beyond the horizon. Cattle, horses, water rights, his wealth was no secret. But what set him apart wasn't just money. Samuel Blake was a man carved by grief, a widower whose wife had died bringing forth their only child, a baby who hadn't lived through the night. Since that day, the rancher carried his sorrow in silence, his heart locked away from the world. Tonight, however, fate had drawn him into this foul barn. He hadn't come for sport. He hadn't come for drink. He had heard whispers of Crowley's special auction, and something, call it instinct, call it providence, pulled him to see for himself. As the laughter rattled the rafters, Blake's boots echoed across the wooden floor. Steady, unhurried. Each step carried a weight that silenced the men nearest him. Heads turned, whispers spread. The crowd thinned around him as if sensing that his presence wasn't meant for jest. "Samuel Blake," one man muttered under his breath, tugging at his collar. "What in blazes is he doing here?" Crowley's grin faltered for the first time that evening. He knew Blake's reputation. The rancher wasn't a man easily fooled or toyed with. Still, Crowley was quick to recover, raising his arms wide in mock welcome. "Well, if it ain't Mr. Blake himself. Come to join the fun, have you? Got your eye on this rare little treasure?" His voice dripped with taunt, eager to put the rancher in the same mocking light as the others. But Samuel didn't answer. He walked forward, his spurs clinking softly, until he stood near the auction platform. His shadow fell over the crate where the newborn lay. The child's whimpers grew faint, her chest rising with shallow breaths. The room held its breath. Blake's voice finally broke the silence, low, steady, and carrying the weight of command. $50! The crowd erupted in gasps and mutters. $50 wasn't pocket change. It was a month's wages for some, a fortune to others. And for a newborn, it made no sense. Crowley blinked, his mouth twitching as he forced out a laugh. "50, you say? Now, gentlemen, do I hear 60? 60, anyone?" His eyes darted desperately around the barn, but no one dared answer. The jest had soured. What had been mockery now felt like something more dangerous. Blake's gaze never left the infant. He didn't blink. He didn't smile. His weathered hand reached inside his coat and pulled out a roll of bills. He tossed them onto the podium, the notes slapping down louder than any gavel. Paid in full. The barn fell silent. Even the drunks, sobered in that moment. Crowley hesitated, his grin twitching into something closer to fear. No one challenged Samuel Blake when he set his mind to something. With a shaky chuckle, he raised his hands. "Well, there we have it, gentlemen. The little one goes to Mr. Blake. Sold." The word echoed like a verdict. Blake stepped forward, scooping the newborn gently into his arms. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't speak another word. With the child nestled against his chest, he turned and strode for the door, his boots striking like the toll of a church bell. Behind him, the whispers began. Some said he'd gone mad. Others claimed darker reasons, that maybe Blake, despite his wealth, was lonelier than folks realized. No one understood why a man like him would pay such a price. But Samuel Blake didn't care. He knew why. and as he stepped into the cold night air, the fragile heartbeat of the child pressed against his chest. He swore that she would not die, not while he still drew breath. The barn was still. For the first time that evening, the raucous laughter and drunken jeers had died away, leaving only the faint hiss of lantern flames and the sound of the baby's soft whimpers against Samuel Blake's chest. No one could believe what they had just seen. A rancher, a man of wealth, strength, and standing, had spent $50 on a newborn. Not a healthy boy to raise as a ranch hand, not a woman for labor, but an infant, red-skinned and frail, her cries more like whispers than wails. To most, it made no sense at all. Crowley, however, wasn't about to let his pride be trampled without a fight. He leaned over the podium, slicking back his greasy hair with a nervous hand. His voice rang out, trying to claw back the room's attention. "Gentlemen, you see it with your own eyes. $50 for a babe that might not see the sunrise. Now tell me, ain't that the damnedest thing you've ever witnessed?" A few men chuckled uneasily, though the laughter carried no real weight. Their eyes weren't on Crowley anymore. They were fixed on Samuel Blake, the way he cradled the infant not with ownership, but with something far more unsettling to them: tenderness. One drunk at the back finally broke the silence. "What in blazes you gonna do with that, Blake? Raise." "Her like a calf? Ain't no sense to it." Blake's jaw tightened, but he gave no reply. He wasn't a man to waste words on fools. He shifted the baby higher against his chest, wrapping her in the warmth of his coat. Crowley's grin sharpened, sensing an opportunity to humiliate him. "Careful now, Mr. Blake. That little scrap of flesh won't last the week. You might have just thrown $50 into a grave." The words hung heavy, cruel, and deliberate. The crowd stirred, some nodding, others whispering their agreement. It was true. The child's breaths were shallow, her tiny fists barely moving. To most eyes, she was already half in the grave. Blake's gaze flicked up, steady and hard as steel. When he finally spoke, his words carried across the barn like the crack of a rifle. "She'll last. She's mine now." The simplicity of it silenced even Crowley. No boasting, no laughter. Just a vow spoken with the conviction of a man who had buried too many promises in the cold earth already. The mother, weak, trembling, tears streaking her cheeks, looked up from where Crowley's men had shoved her. Her eyes met Blake's, wide with disbelief. For a fleeting moment, hope sparked across her face, but it faded just as quickly, drowned in exhaustion and despair. Blake gave her a single nod, firm but wordless. To him, no explanation was needed. She had brought the child into the world, and he would see that life carried forward. With the infant secure, Blake turned his back on the podium. His boots struck the wooden planks with the steady rhythm of a man who had already made his choice. The crowd parted like a herd before a storm, whispers chasing him, but no one daring to stand in his way. Outside, the night wind caught his coat, swirling dust around him as he crossed the darkened street. The baby whimpered weakly against his chest, her breath warm against his shirt. Blake adjusted his hold, as though to shield her from not just the cold, but the eyes of a world that had already judged her unworthy. Behind him, the barn doors creaked, shut. Inside, the murmurs rose again, fueled by Crowley's bitterness. Some claimed Blake had lost his mind. Others muttered that no amount of money could change the fact that death was likely waiting for that child before morning. But Blake wasn't listening. He mounted his horse, one arm steadying the fragile bundle. The mare shifted beneath him, sensing the weight of something unusual, something fragile and alive. Blake leaned close, whispering into the night as though the words were meant for the baby alone. "You'll live," he said quietly. "A vow only." The wind carried away. "By God, you'll live." And with that, he rode into the darkness, carrying with him not just a newborn child, but the beginning of a story that no one in Dry Creek would ever forget. By dawn, word of the strange sale had spread through Dry Creek like prairie fire on a windy day. Every saloon, every mercantile, every corner of the little town buzzed with the same tale. Samuel Blake, the wealthy rancher, had spent 50 hard-earned dollars, not on cattle, not on land, but on a baby that most figured wouldn't survive the night. In the saloon, men laughed over their morning whiskey. $50 for a squalling brat? One barkeep jeered. Hell, I wouldn't give 50 cents for a full-grown woman, much less one still dripping from birth. The room erupted with coarse laughter, though not everyone joined in. So, the blacksmith's forge? The hammer paused mid-swing. Mark my words, the smith muttered, sweat beading his brow. There's something more to this. Blake ain't the kind of man to waste money on foolishness. His apprentice shrugged, but the unease lingered. Even at the church steps, whispers curled around the preacher. It's unnatural, an old woman said, clutching her shawl tight. Buying a babe like she's cattle ain't God's way. The preacher's eyes narrowed, though he gave no answer. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone thought they knew the truth. Yet none of them had been there when Blake carried that fragile bundle out of Crowley's barn. None of them had seen the way his arms closed protectively around her, or how his voice steadied like a promise carved in stone. At Blake's ranch, the household buzzed with its own confusion. His longtime housekeeper, Martha, nearly dropped. The kettle when she saw him ride in with a newborn wrapped in his coat. "Merciful Lord Samuel, what have you done?" she gasped, rushing to his side. Blake dismounted carefully, cradling the child against his chest. His eyes were tired, shadowed with the weight of the night. "She's cold," he said simply. "She needs warmth." Martha pressed a hand to her mouth, then hurried him inside. They laid the baby before the hearth, feeding the fire until the room glowed. Blake's large, calloused hands looked almost foreign as he adjusted the cloth around the tiny body. The baby stirred faintly, letting out a thin cry. "She's half gone already," Martha whispered, kneeling close. "What on earth possessed you to—" Blake cut her off with a look, his voice low but firm. "Don't matter what possessed me. She's mine now." Martha studied him for a long moment. She had known Samuel Blake through joy and grief, through his marriage and the crushing loss that had followed. She had seen him turn to stone after burying both wife and child in the same grave. Yet now she saw something flickering in his eyes again, something she thought had died with them. "You mean to raise her?" she asked quietly. Blake's gaze never left the child. "I mean for her to live." The ranch hands, tough men, hardened by years of cattle drives and dust storms, gawked when word reached them. Some muttered it was madness. A few laughed behind Blake's back, claiming no rancher worth his salt could afford to waste time on a dying newborn. But none dared speak their doubts to his face. Samuel Blake was a man you didn't question lightly. Back in town, the rumors grew darker. Some whispered that Blake had finally lost his mind. Others claimed he had bought the child for strange, selfish reasons, that loneliness had twisted him into something unnatural. Crowley, bitter from losing his profit, stoked the talk with venom, spreading tales of Blake's supposed weakness. But Samuel Blake paid no mind to the gossip. His world had narrowed to the fragile heartbeat pressed against his chest, the faint cries echoing in his quiet ranch house. That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Blake sat by the fire with the baby nestled in his arms. Martha hovered nearby, her hands busy, though her eyes softened when she looked at them. "You'll be mocked for this, Samuel," she said gently. "They'll never understand." Blake's jaw tightened. He brushed a rough thumb across the baby's cheek, where the skin was soft as silk. "They don't need to understand," he murmured. "She ain't theirs." Outside, the prairie wind howled through the grass, carrying with it the voices of a town that would never stop whispering. But inside, Samuel Blake made his vow again in silence. This child would not be another grave. in his life. Not while he had the strength to fight for her, and though the world thought him a fool, Blake knew the truth. His purchase wasn't madness. It wasn't weakness. It was redemption. The newborn was small enough to fit in the crook of Samuel Blake's arm, lighter than a sack of flour, yet heavier than any burden he'd carried in years. Through the long night, he sat by the fire, listening to the faint sound of her breathing. Thin, fragile, and uneven. Every pause in her tiny chest made his heart hammer like hooves on hard earth. By morning, the baby's color had faded to a pale gray. Martha wrung her hands, her worry plain as day. "She won't last, Samuel. Not without a doctor." And even then, she let the words trail off. Blake stood, his movements deliberate. "Fetch my horse," he ordered. "If she's got a chance, Doc Harlan will give it to her." Within minutes, he was in the saddle again, the child wrapped snug in his coat, her head resting against his chest. The prairie air cut sharp and cold, but he rode hard, the ranch house shrinking behind him as he pressed toward town. Dust rose in his wake, his jaw set against the biting wind. The townsfolk stared as Blake thundered down Main Street, clutching the bundle to his chest. Whispers sprang up like weeds. "There he goes, running with that baby like it's gold. Waste of time, that one's already half dead." Blake's lost his senses, mark my words. But the rancher didn't slow, didn't even glance their way. His spurs dug in, and within moments he was at the door of the doctor's office. Doc. Harlan was an older man, weathered and weary, his beard flecked with gray. He had brought more lives into the world than anyone in Dry Creek could count, and he had buried nearly as many. When Blake shoved through the door, Harlan's brows shot. "Up, good Lord, Sam, what have you got there?" "A baby," Blake said gruffly. "Weak. Born last night. She needs you." The doctor blinked, surprised at the urgency in Blake's voice, but wasted no time. He cleared the table, motioned for Blake to set the child down, and began his work. For long, tense minutes, the room filled with the rustle of cloth and the doctor's low mutterings. He checked her breathing, pressed his stethoscope against the tiny chest, frowned at the faint flutter of her pulse. Blake stood stiff as a post, every muscle tight, his fists clenched at his sides. Finally, Harlan leaned back, sighing. "She's weak, no doubt about it. Born too soon, most likely. Won't be easy." Blake's voice was sharp, almost desperate. "But she can live?" The doctor hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Aye. With care. Warmth. Milk enough to keep her strength. But it'll take constant watching. You understand me? One slip, and she's gone." "I understand." Harlan glanced at him, studying the rancher's face. "Sam, you know this ain't your fight. Why risk yourself for—" Blake cut him off with a look, the kind that silenced questions before they were born. "It's my fight now." The doctor said nothing more. He scribbled a list of instructions, handed over what little medicine he thought might help, and placed the child back into Blake's arms. "Do right by her, then. That's all you can do." Blake's arms tightened around the fragile bundle, and for the first time since the night before, the baby let out a faint, almost steady cry. The sound struck him deep, as though the child was clinging not just to life, but to him. By the time he rode back to the ranch, the sun hung high, and the prairie shimmered with heat. Martha met him at the door, her apron dusted with flour. Her eyes searched his face, and when she saw the sliver of hope there, she let out a shaky breath. "Well," she said softly, "if you're bound and determined, then we'll see it through." That night, as the fire burned low, Samuel Blake rocked the child in his arms. The prairie wind howled outside, but inside, the baby slept against his chest, her breath still fragile yet steadier than before. He spoke in a low voice, not to Martha, not to the empty house, but to the child herself. "You hold on, little one. You hold on and I'll see to the rest. It wasn't just a promise. It was a vow born from loss, carved deep into the heart of a man who refused to let death take what little light the world had left to give him. The days that followed were a battle. Every hour, Samuel Blake and Martha took turns tending the child, feeding her by drops from a tin spoon, keeping her wrapped in blankets near the hearth. The baby's cries were still faint, more like the mewls of a kitten than the wails of a newborn. But she clung to life with a stubbornness that stirred something, deep inside the old rancher. On the third evening, the prairie sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold. Inside the big ranch house, the fire snapped and cracked, throwing warm light across the room. Martha busied herself with chores, though she kept glancing toward the rocker by the fire where Blake sat, the baby resting against his chest. Blake had barely moved for hours. His broad frame dwarfed the fragile bundle he held, but the way he cradled her was gentle, almost reverent. His thumb brushed absently over the child's cheek, as if the touch itself might anchor her to the world. Martha finally broke the silence. "Samuel," she said softly, setting down her mending. "I've known you near 20 years. I've seen you weather drought and death, loss and loneliness, but I never seen you take to anything like this." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been gnawing at her. "Why her? Why now?" Blake didn't answer at once. His gaze was fixed on the flames, his jaw set, as though the words had to be wrestled from somewhere deep inside. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough. "She reminds me," he said, "of what I lost." Martha's eyes softened. She knew. Everyone in Dry Creek knew. Years ago, Samuel Blake had buried his wife, Caroline, and the child she had died bringing into the world. He had never spoken much of it, but the grief had hollowed him out, leaving him colder, quieter, a man who lived more in the saddle than among people. Blake shifted the baby in his arms, his gaze dropping to her tiny face. "When Caroline passed, I told myself I'd never feel this weight again. Never hold something so fragile, knowing the world could take it in an instant." His voice cracked slightly, though he steadied it. "But last night, when I saw this little one on that crate, fighting for every breath, it was like staring at the past. Only this time, I had a chance to change it." Martha blinked back tears, her hands clasped tight in her lap. "So this ain't just charity." Blake shook his head slowly. "It's redemption." The baby stirred, letting out a soft whimper. Blake rocked her gently, his rough voice lowering to a whisper. "Caroline wanted a child more than anything. She never got to hold ours. But I'll be damned if I let this one slip away too. Not while I can still fight for her." Martha rose, crossing the room to place a hand on his shoulder. "Then we'll fight, Samuel. Both of us. She'll have a home here, no matter what the town says." Blake glanced up, meeting Martha's steady gaze. For the first time in years, a flicker of gratitude softened his hardened features. He gave a single nod. The firelight danced across the room, casting long shadows that reached into the corners of the ranch house. Outside, the coyotes called across the prairie, their howls mournful and distant. But inside, for the first time, in a long while, the house felt alive, not with wealth or cattle, but with the fragile promise of new life. Blake leaned back in the rocker. The baby nestled against him, her breathing steady, her warmth pressing against his chest. His eyes drifted shut, though his arms never loosened. For a man who had lived with ghosts for so long, the revelation was clear as the stars burning over the plains. This child was no accident, no foolish purchase. She was his second chance. The following weeks were a test of endurance, for the baby, for Martha, and most of all for Samuel Blake. The infant, whom Martha had begun calling Little One, hovered between life and death with each passing day. Some mornings she would cry with surprising strength, her tiny fists clenched tight, as though she meant to fight the world itself. But by nightfall, her breathing would falter, shallow and uneven, leaving Blake staring into the dark, terrified that she might not live to see the dawn. The rancher, who had once commanded cattle herds and horse drives, now measured his days in spoonfuls of milk and the rhythm of a fragile heartbeat. He slept little, rising through the night to check the fire, to feel the warmth of her skin, to make sure she still drew breath. His hands, rough from years of rope and reins, grew steady and practiced in cradling something so impossibly small. But outside the walls of the ranch house, the world was far less kind. In town, the gossip only grew sharper. At the saloon, men snickered into their whiskey glasses. "Blake's gone soft," one muttered. $50 for a brat that's half in the grave. What good's a rancher who coddles a child? At the general store, women whispered behind their bonnets. "It's unnatural, raising a baby that ain't his. Folks'll talk. They'll say he's lost his senses." Even the blacksmith, who respected Blake more than most, shook his head when pressed. "Man's throwing his strength away. That child won't see the spring." The words reached Samuel's ears more than once. Ranch hands carried them home, or a passerby let them slip, testing to see if they could rattle him. But Blake never flinched. He met each whisper the same way he met a storm, by tightening his grip on the reins and pressing forward. Still, doubt gnawed at him in the quiet hours. He would watch the baby's chest rise and fall, hear the faint wheeze of her breath, and wonder if the town was right. If he had only bought himself another grave. One night, as a bitter wind howled across the plains, the child grew cold and still. Panic tore through him like a bullet. He carried her close to the fire, rubbing her tiny arms, whispering her back to life with a desperation that cracked his voice. "Come on, little one," he pleaded. "Don't you quit now. You hold on. You fight." Minutes dragged into eternity. Then, with a ragged breath, the baby whimpered. The sound was weak, but to Blake it was sweeter than a church hymn. Relief washed through him, though his hands trembled as he held her. He pressed his lips against her forehead, whispering a vow that was half prayer, half promise. "You're stronger than they know. Stronger than me, even. We'll prove 'em wrong, you and I." Martha found him there, slumped in the rocker with the baby on his chest, both wrapped in his coat. She said nothing, only laid another log on the fire and sat beside him, her knitting untouched in her lap. She knew that words were useless against the kind of battle he was fighting, one measured not in days or dollars, but in sheer stubborn will. By the time spring rains softened the prairie, the baby was still alive, thin, fragile, but alive. Each day her cries grew louder, her grip a little firmer, her eyes a little brighter, and though the town still whispered, though the men at the saloon still laughed into their drinks, Samuel Blake held his head high. For in his arms, against all odds, life had chosen to cling. It wasn't victory yet. The struggle was far from over. But the rancher who had once lived with nothing but grief now carried a spark of defiance in his chest. If death wanted this child, it would have to come through him first. By the time spring warmed the prairie, the little one was still alive. Thin, fragile, but alive. Every cry that echoed through the ranch house was a victory. Every restless kick a sign that she was clawing her way into life with a stubbornness that matched Samuel Blake himself. At first it had been survival. Nights spent hovering over her cradle, days spent measuring spoonfuls of milk, firewood, and prayers. But slowly, almost without Blake noticing, the struggle shifted. The ranch house, once heavy with silence, began to stir with something it hadn't known in years. Life. Martha saw it first. She caught the way Blake leaned over the cradle just to watch the baby's eyes flutter open. The way his weathered hand, rough as rawhide, would grow impossibly gentle when she wrapped her tiny fingers around his thumb. The way he smiled, small, fleeting, almost reluctant, when her cries grew strong enough to shake the rafters. "You're softening, Samuel," Martha teased one morning as she poured his coffee. Blake glanced up, brow furrowed, though there was no fire in his look. "I'm still the same man." "Maybe," Martha said with a knowing grin. "But I never heard the same man talking to a baby like she's the only soul in the room." Blake didn't argue. He couldn't, because she was right. At first, he'd spoken to the child out of habit, words whispered into the quiet while he paced the floor, rocking her against his chest. But now he found himself telling her stories of the land, of the cattle drives, of storms survived and winters endured. He told her about her namesake, too, the name he had finally chosen. "Hope," he said one evening, his voice steady as he looked down at the child in his arms. "That's what you are. Hope." The name fit her, small and simple, yet powerful enough to change the air in the room. As weeks passed, the bond deepened. When Hope cried, it was Blake she reached for, her tiny arms straining toward his broad chest. When she laughed, an uncertain sound at first, more a gurgle than a chuckle, it was at the rumble of his voice or the shadow of his hat tilting over her crib. And with every new sign of her strength, something long buried in Blake began to stir. The cold weight of grief that had pressed on him for years seemed to ease, replaced by a warmth he hadn't thought possible. Yet outside the ranch, the world still whispered. At the saloon, men shook their heads. "Blake's lost to that brat. Can't get nothing done on the ranch while he plays nursemaid." At church, tongues wagged. It ain't right. A man raising a girl on his own, not by blood nor law. But the ridicule rolled off Blake like rain on stone. Each night, when Hope's small body curled against his chest, he knew the truth that no gossip could touch. This child wasn't a burden. She was a gift. One evening, as dusk settled over the plains, Blake sat on the porch with Hope in his lap. The prairie stretched endless before them, painted gold by the setting sun. The wind carried the smell of spring grass, and the cattle lowed in the distance. Hope reached up, grasping at his hat brim with clumsy hands, her laughter bubbling like a spring creek. Blake chuckled, an honest, deep sound that startled even him. He tipped the hat low, brushing it against her face until she squealed. For the first time in years, the sound of laughter, real, living laughter, rose from the Blake ranch. Martha watched from the doorway, her arms crossed, a soft smile touching her face. She'd seen Samuel Blake at his strongest, his most stubborn, his most broken. But this was different. This was a man finding life again, not through cattle, not through land, but through a bond no one had expected. Blake looked down at the little girl, her eyes bright as stars, and whispered words only she could hear. "You saved me too." And in that moment, the bond was no longer unexpected. It was unshakable. By the time summer rolled across the prairie, little Hope was no longer the frail, silent bundle Samuel Blake had carried out of Dry Creek's auction yard. She was plumper now, her cheeks full and rosy, her cry strong enough to startle even. The horses in the corral. She gripped Blake's thumb with the strength of a calf pulling at its rope, and when she laughed, the sound filled the ranch house like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. For Martha, it was a miracle. For Blake, it was proof. Proof that the life he had fought for, through ridicule, sleepless nights, and endless doubt, was worth every ounce of strength he'd given. But the town was slower to change. At first, the whispers only grew. "Blake's playing nursemaid," the men at the saloon scoffed. "Won't be long before he loses his ranch." The women at the store frowned. "No wife, no kin. What's he mean raising a girl alone?" Yet little by little the ridicule began to falter. It started one Sunday morning. The church bell rang, and to everyone's surprise, Blake strode up the steps with Hope cradled against his chest. Folks turned their heads, expecting to see the same grim rancher who had kept to himself for years. But instead, They saw a man carrying a child who stared back with wide, curious eyes. When the preacher spoke, Hope cooed softly, and Blake rocked her gently, his gaze fixed on her instead of the pulpit. Martha, seated beside him, noticed the change ripple through the pews. Whispers still filled the air, but this time they carried less malice and more wonder. Then came the day of the storm. A sudden downpour swept across Dry Creek, flooding the creek bed and threatening to drown the cattle herds penned near town. Ranchers scrambled, their shouts lost in the roar of the rain, and at the center of it all was Blake, hat low, reins tight, driving his herd with a strength that belied his years. Men watched as he hauled calves out of the mud, his arms slick with rain, his boots sinking into the muck. He worked without pause, his jaw set, his eyes burning with determination. And when another rancher's fence line broke, it was Blake who rallied the men to drive the stray cattle to safety. By nightfall, when the storm passed, the herds were saved, and so was the livelihood of half the town. Folks stood in the mud, soaked to the bone, staring at Blake with something new in their eyes. Not ridicule, not pity, but respect. That evening, back at the saloon, the talk had changed. "Man still knows how to lead," one rancher admitted, lifting his glass. "And that little girl? Maybe she's what keeps him fighting." At the general store, the women spoke softer now. "Did you see her? That baby's getting strong. Healthiest cry I ever heard." "Maybe he ain't so mad after all," another added, almost reluctantly. The turning point came when Doc Harlan, the town's physician, stopped by the ranch. He'd heard the rumors of the baby's frailty, had expected to find a sickly child clinging to life. Instead, he found Hope sitting in Blake's lap, her eyes bright, her laughter bubbling as she tugged at his beard. "She's strong," the doctor said after a long examination. "Healthier than I expected. You've done right by her, Samuel." For the first time, Blake heard validation spoken aloud, not just whispered in his heart. The town still gossiped, old habits died hard, but now the talk carried a different tone. Curiosity turned to admiration, suspicion to respect. Folks began tipping their hats when Blake rode through town, their eyes lingering not just on him, but on the little girl bundled in his arms. And though Blake never sought their approval, he carried himself a little taller, his hat tilted just so, as if to say he had nothing to prove. Because the truth was plain for anyone with eyes to see. Samuel Blake had saved a child. But in doing so, the child had saved him too. The seasons rolled on, carrying Dry Creek from summer's burning sun to autumn's golden winds. By then, little Hope had become the heartbeat of the Blake Ranch. She toddled through the halls in her small leather boots, her laughter ringing off the wooden beams. She clung to Samuel's finger when they walked the fence line, and when he set her atop his saddle, she squealed with delight, as though the whole prairie belonged to her. For Blake, the ranch no longer felt like a hollow monument to loss. The silence that had haunted its rooms since Caroline's death was gone, replaced by the sound of small footsteps, the rustle of blankets, the sweet chaos of a child discovering life. Martha often said, "She don't just live here, Samuel. She brings life here." And she was right. Hope grew stronger by the day. Her cheeks were ruddy with health, her eyes bright with mischief. She had a way of disarming even the most stubborn men in town. The same ranch hands who once mocked Blake now found themselves carving little wooden toys for her or slipping her peppermint sticks from the store. Even the saloon crowd, hardened men who rarely spared a smile, tipped their hats when Blake rode in with Hope perched proudly in front of him on the saddle. Respect had turned into something deeper, admiration, and admiration had turned into quiet gratitude. One evening, near the close of autumn, Blake stood on his porch with hope in his arms. The prairie stretched endless before them, the horizon aflame with the dying sun. The air was cool, the smell of wood smoke drifting from the chimney, the cattle lowing in the distance. Hope nestled against his chest, her tiny hand curled around the button of his vest. She looked up at him with eyes that mirrored the wide, unbroken sky. Blake cleared his throat, speaking softly, more to himself than to her. "When I first brought you home, little one, they said you wouldn't last a week, said I was a fool to try, but you proved 'em all wrong, stronger than me, stronger than anyone gave you credit for." He paused, his voice thickening. "I thought I was saving you that day. But truth is, you saved me. You gave me back something I thought was gone forever." Martha stepped quietly onto the porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She heard his words, but said nothing, letting him speak the truth he had carried too long in silence. Blake rocked Hope gently, his eyes fixed on the glowing horizon. "I lost a family once, lost my heart with 'em, but now I reckon I've been given a second chance, and I'll spend the rest of my days making sure you never doubt you're loved, never fear you're alone. You hear me, Hope? You're my legacy, my reason." The child cooed softly, as if she understood. The years ahead would bring challenges, storms, droughts, and the trials of raising a girl in a land as unforgiving as the West. But Samuel Blake was no longer a man haunted by ghosts. He was a man, anchored by purpose, steeled by love. The town of Dry Creek would one day tell stories of him, not just of the rancher who saved herds in a flood or the man who stood taller than the storms. They would speak of the day he walked into an auction yard, placed $50 on the table, and carried home a bleeding newborn no one else wanted. And they would say it wasn't just the child who was saved that day. It was Samuel Blake himself, as the stars broke across the night sky. Blake tightened his hold on Hope, the warmth of her small body against him. For the first time in decades, the future didn't look like an empty trail stretching into nothing. It looked like love. It looked like family. It looked like hope.